In the quiet stillness of a New York brownstone, a single letter arrives, and with it, a trail of guilt buried beneath orchids, lies, and legacy. It's a case where silence speaks louder than truth, and even justice feels strangely hollow. A woman walks without protest. A father whispers from beyond the grave, and the last word never quite gets spoken. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. It wasn't just that he was sitting in Wolfe's office without an appointment. That happened from time to time, usually when someone slipped in while I was checking Fritz's spice levels or deterring a reporter at the door. But this one was different. He was too still, too composed, and entirely too comfortable for a man sitting in a room he wasn't invited into. He looked to be in his mid-60s, dressed with the sort of restraint that costs money to pull off. The wool of his jacket was fine enough to absorb the morning light. His shoes were black, not new, but cared for the way some men care for reputations, relentlessly. I didn't like him, and I didn't know why yet. Ordinarily, I said, stepping in, you'd be asked who you are, who let you in, and how you plan to pay for the time you've stolen. I'm flexible on order. He smiled faintly and said, I was told Nero Wolfe doesn't answer the door, but his assistant does. That earned him a point. Maybe half a point. I picked up the phone to buzz Wolfe. Something told me this wasn't going to be a quick hello and goodbye. Wolfe entered 10 minutes later, glowering. I had informed him of the interruption with the appropriate level of menace, and he had come down from the plant rooms with the same enthusiasm he reserves for fire drills and famine. The man stood to greet him, not nervously, not reverently, just politely. Wolfe took his chair, glared, and said, You are? Maxwell Varden, the man replied. You may know the name. I did. So did Wolfe. Reclusive billionaire, made his fortune in patents that made other people richer. Owned 3 companies, no friends, and a legal team that frightened people with unlisted numbers. Not the type to walk into a room without a reason. I have a request, Varden continued. He placed a thick envelope on Wolfe's desk. I want you to open this only after I'm dead. Wolfe stared at it like it might explode. That can be arranged, Wolfe said dryly. But I suggest a lawyer. This isn't a will, Varden replied. It's a confession, or something like one. I raised an eyebrow. Wolfe folded his hands across his girth. The air tightened. You wish us to investigate your murder in advance, Wolfe said. Precisely, Varden replied. If someone kills me, I want you to expose them. If I kill myself, you'll know why. Either way, you'll have a truth to work with. Wolfe let out a breath through his nose. That, sir, is melodrama, and I loathe melodrama. Varden didn't flinch. I noticed then that he hadn't flinched once. I do not take commissions posthumously, Wolfe said, his voice dry as a crate of stale biscuits. It insults the linear function of reason. Varden didn't blink. It is precisely because I will no longer be alive that I trust your objectivity. That, Wolfe replied, is not a compliment. It is an evasion. He leaned back in his chair, templed his fingers, and surveyed Varden as if weighing his density per cubic ego. You presume I will be manipulated by mystery. You are mistaken. I detest riddles disguised as jobs. Not a riddle, Varden said. An obligation. Phooey, Wolfe muttered. The envelope remained on the desk like a challenge. Wolfe did not touch it. I watched the silent tug-of-war between the invitation to solve and Wolfe's ironclad distaste for drama. Finally, Wolfe shifted his eyes toward me. Mr. Goodwin, if he is not gone in 60 seconds, summon a patrolman. Varden didn't look offended. If anything, he seemed satisfied. I didn't expect enthusiasm, he said, rising. Just awareness. He turned, left the envelope untouched, and walked out as if he had just made a successful sale to a reluctant buyer. Wolfe stared after him, lips pursed. I reached for the envelope, but Wolfe stopped me with a glance. Leave it, he said. If we indulge the dead, they'll never leave us alone. I followed him out, not because Wolfe told me to, he hadn't, but because something about Maxwell Varden made my instincts itch like a wool sweater in August. He took the elevator down alone. I gave it 10 seconds and followed, catching a glimpse of him crossing 35th Street with a kind of deliberate pace that said he wasn't just walking, he was exiting. Not from the office, but from something bigger. Maybe life. He didn't have a driver, no bodyguard, no assistant trailing behind with a tablet and a schedule. For a man with 11 patents and a reputation for paranoia, he was travelling remarkably light. He got into a sedan that looked too modest and too clean and pulled out into traffic without so much as a look over his shoulder. I didn't follow beyond the corner. There wasn't a tale to be had. I just stood there and watched until his car disappeared in the blur of yellow cabs and bad tempers. Something told me the next time I saw him, he wouldn't be breathing. I headed back to the brownstone, feeling like I'd just watched a man erase his own signature from the page. Fritz brought in dinner that night, roast squab with a balsamic glaze, and I had just finished pouring Wolfe's beer when the phone rang. Fritz picked it up in the hall, listened, and then came into the dining room with the kind of hesitation he reserves for natural disasters and unsolicited guests. "Excuse me, Mr. Wolfe," he said. "It's the police." That got Wolfe's attention. Barely. "They say Mr. Varden is dead." Wolfe paused mid-cut. His knife hung above the bird like it had forgotten what gravity was for. "Suicide," Fritz added. "His penthouse suite. Pentobarbital and vodka. Very neat." Wolfe set the knife down gently, not with surprise, but with calculation. He didn't speak, just stared at his plate, like it had revealed a secret ingredient. "He left a note," I asked Fritz. "No note, but the staff found the door locked from the inside. No signs of entry." I turned to Wolfe. He was stirring his beer now, slowly, clockwise. Wolfe never stirs his beer. After a full minute, he finally said, "That man was not inclined to surrender control, not even of death." Which, coming from Wolfe, was practically grief. He picked up his knife again, but he didn't eat. The next morning, I was halfway through my second cup of coffee and contemplating a strategic breakfast when the doorbell rang. Fritz answered. A delivery man, young and slightly damp, handed over a thick envelope with no return address and no expression. It was addressed to Wolfe. No stamp, no seal, no sender. I brought it into the office. Wolfe was at his desk, reading Montaigne in the original French, which is his version of light entertainment. I set the envelope down without comment. He looked at it, just once. Then back to his book. "It's the same one," I said. "The one he tried to leave behind." Wolfe didn't answer. He kept reading. I waited. Nothing. No snort, no tirade, not even a grunt. "Want me to open it?" "No." He turned a page. We sat in that room, Wolfe and I, and the envelope sat with us like it had always belonged. Maybe it did. After a minute, I said, "He said you'd hear from him." This time, Wolfe didn't respond. The envelope remained sealed. So did Wolfe. But neither, I knew, would stay that way for long. It was one of those rare moments when Wolfe allowed curiosity to outweigh contempt. He didn't say it, naturally. He merely nudged the envelope an inch closer with a pinky and inclined his head, which in Wolfen terms is equivalent to a drum roll. I took the hint, slid a letter opener under the flap, and began reading aloud. It wasn't long. 3 typed pages, single-spaced, but it had the weight of something written with an unsteady hand and a steadier intention. Varden had titled it, "For Mr. Wolfe, upon my passing." I spared Wolfe the grimace that wanted out and went on. The letter wasn't a confession so much as a warning wrapped in silk. Varden named 3 individuals: Clara Varden, his daughter, estranged and dangerously principled; Gregory Sloane, former COO and habitually ambitious; and Lucien Dross, a man who walks with the past on his shoulders. Then came the line Wolfe would later dissect like a rare fungus. They are not all villains. One is merely too loyal. One is indifferent. The last will kill. The letter offered no proof, no chronology, no crime. Just those names, that sentence, and an undertone of calculated despair. When I finished, Wolfe said nothing for a long moment. Then, beer. I fetched it. Wolfe had taken the letter to his desk, but he didn't reread it. He let the phrase linger in the air like a medicinal vapor. I watched him, waiting for thunder or snort. What came was more surgical. An amateur's riddle, he said at last, posed by a man who mistook implication for clarity. Still, I offered, he wasn't stupid. No, Wolfe agreed, merely vain. He presumed insight would survive ambiguity. He tapped the edge of the page with a fingernail. Loyalty can be a motive, indifference a shield, and murder a form of conclusion. But these categories are fluid. Mr. Varden has not assisted us. He has challenged us. I said, "You're not refusing the case." "I do not accept cases from the dead," Wolfe replied. "But I do not ignore invitations from the intelligent." Which, as close as Wolfe would get to enthusiasm, was already halfway to a commitment. He pushed the letter aside and turned to me. "Begin with the daughter, Clara. She's the only one he describes with emotion. Proceed with all due skepticism." I nodded and reached for the file drawer. He poured another half-inch of beer. Clara Varden wasn't easy to find, but that didn't stop the public from having opinions about her. Half the internet seemed to think she was either a brilliant radical or an entitled brat with a poetry complex. I kept my distance from both theories and focused on what could be confirmed. She hadn't spoken to her father in 7 years. That much everyone agreed on. The split, according to a profile in a European literary review, came after she accused him of institutionalized cruelty through economic imperialism. I had to look that one up, and I still didn't like what I found. She'd lived in Lisbon, Marrakesh, and most recently Brooklyn, the latter suggesting she hadn't lost her appetite for artisanal coffee or ideological friction. Her poems were dense, often angry, and full of words like hunger, inheritance, and engines of silence, whatever that meant. Still, buried in all the performance was a truth. She had intelligence, conviction, and a need to sever herself from her father's name like a limb with rot in the bone. Wolfe read a few lines I printed and grunted. He feared her. Because she was loud, I asked. Because she saw him, Wolfe said, and perhaps saw through him. That gave him pause. Which meant I'd hit something. Next up was Gregory Sloane, the kind of name that comes already monogrammed. Sloane had been Varden's right hand for 15 years, and then, abruptly, he wasn't. The severance was sealed tighter than a monastery, but the tremors it left behind were still echoing through the glass towers of Midtown. I spoke with a financial reporter who'd covered the split. She said Sloane had been amicably dismissed, which is PR speak for someone had pictures or leverage. There were whispers, unconfirmed of course, of legal threats, NDAs, and an internal vote that went sideways. Sloane hadn't taken it lightly. He'd gone quiet for 6 weeks, then resurfaced at a boutique firm consulting on post-legacy innovation, which is just enough jargon to hide a grudge behind. No clear alibi the night Varden died. No public statement. Just a few thin smiles on business panels, and one comment, buried in an interview. The best systems know when to eject defective modules. Wolfe, upon hearing that, muttered, "Metaphor is a poor substitute for confession." Still, I marked him as capable, polished, presentable, and very possibly the kind of man who would rather kill than be embarrassed in a quarterly report. Wolfe gave no opinion, but I could tell. He was listening harder now. Lucien Dross was, in theory, a man. In practice, he was a ghost in pinstripes. His name surfaced in SEC filings from the early years of Varden's rise, never prominently, never publicly, but often enough to suggest he'd been more than just a passenger. Then, nothing. Around 2009, Dross vanished from the record, like someone had vacuumed him out of the footnotes. I went digging. A minor arrest for fraud interstate, Wyoming of all places, back in '98. No mugshots after that. No license renewals. No tax filings. No social media footprint. No obituary. Either the man was dead, reborn, or hiding with the kind of help you can't buy legally. Wolfe was intrigued, which meant he leaned back and closed his eyes. "When a ghost is listed among the suspects, Mr. Goodwin," he said, "we may presume the story has teeth." "Or claws," I said. "Or both," he replied. I printed what I could. It wasn't much, but Wolfe read it 3 times. "He does not belong," Wolfe murmured. "Yet he persists. That makes him essential." That was Wolfe's way of saying, keep going. So I did. I was 2 clicks away from shutting down for the night and letting Fritz redeem the evening with something warm when Wolfe called me back into the office. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He was at his desk, still in his chair, the letter from Varden beside him like a third guest at dinner. "The city morgue," he said without preamble, "has misplaced Mr. Varden's body." That stopped me. "They what?" "They claim it was a clerical mishap. I do not believe in such things. Neither should you." I sat down. "He's gone?" "Gone," Wolfe said. "Not buried, not released. Gone." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "I do not appreciate being recruited by the dead, but I find I resent being outmaneuvered by them even more." I didn't answer, because for once, I didn't have anything clever to say. The case, it seemed, had just stood up on its own, 2 feet, and walked off the slab. Inspector Kramer did not knock. He never knocks. He storms. And this particular morning, the storm arrived with overcoat flapping and eyes sharper than regulation steel. I intercepted him in the hall, but only technically. He brushed past like I was a coat rack that had spoken out of turn. "Where is he?" Kramer barked. "In his chair," I said. "Where else?" Wolfe didn't rise. He barely looked up. Kramer paced in with the kind of energy that usually precedes arrests or ulcers. "We have a situation," he said. "That seems to be the consensus," Wolfe replied, folding his hands. Kramer dropped the morning's bomb like a badge. "Maxwell Varden's body is missing." "Indeed," Wolfe murmured. "You knew." "I suspected." Kramer rounded on him. "You're involved. Don't play the blind monk with me. Did he send you that envelope before he died?" "I neither confirm nor deny," Wolfe said. "You may take that as refusal or restraint." Kramer's glare could have melted glass. "You're dancing too close to obstruction." "And you, Inspector," Wolfe said coolly, "are treading on constitutional soil." I was already eyeing the door and planning a plausible denial when Kramer turned to me. "Watch your back, Goodwin. This one's going to rot fast." He left without slamming the door. That worried me more than if he had. Clara Varden's loft was in Greenwich Village, on a block that reeked of turmeric, solvents, and inherited righteousness. I climbed 3 flights past abstract murals and flyers for revolution-themed open mics, then knocked on a door painted matte black and splattered with what may have once been a manifesto. She let me in without comment. The air inside smelled of turpentine, coffee, and something burned, possibly on purpose. Clara herself looked like she'd emerged from a chiaroscuro painting. Pale skin, cropped black hair, and a sweater that was either fashionable or accidental. Her eyes were steady and unkind. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, without asking who I was. "Miss Varden," I said. "I'd say sorry about your father, but that would require your face to move." "He died a long time ago," she said, turning back to her easel. I asked where she'd been the night he supposedly took his own life. She answered calmly. A poetry reading in Fort Greene, with 20 witnesses, 2 of whom were professors. She had photos, if I needed them. I asked if she'd spoken to him recently. He called 3 weeks ago, she said. I didn't answer. That was our routine. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. As I left, I noticed the only framed photo in the room, a dog-eared picture of a young Clara with her father, both laughing. It was covered in dust. If Clara was an open wound in a scarf, Gregory Sloane was a silk glove full of poker chips. His office in Midtown looked like it had been steam-cleaned with money. Brushed steel, smoked, glass, and one chair that cost more than my first car. He stood to greet me, offered a handshake that wasn't limp, but tried very hard not to be firm. A professional's handshake, non-committal, balanced, and devoid of fingerprints. "You're with Mr. Wolfe?" he asked. "Perpetually," I said. He gestured for me to sit, then launched into a narrative that was 3 parts resignation and 1 part thinly veiled relief. Maxwell was brilliant, he said. But he'd become unreachable. Delusions of betrayal, layers of security. He kept dossiers on people he hadn't seen in years. Paranoia, I offered. More than that, he said. Fear of irrelevance. He handed me a few printed emails, Varden's own words, scattered and grandiose. Talk of enemies, surveillance, misdirection. If it had come from anyone else, I'd have called it a spiral. Sloane's voice lowered. He was planning something. I just don't know whether it was legal or theatrical. I left with the emails and a feeling that Sloane knew more than he admitted, and less than he wanted me to think. Lucian Dross was a man who left shadows, not footprints. His name appeared in Varden's corporate records like a watermark, always faint, never absent. But when I tried to locate him, I found the digital equivalent of fog. No phone number, no recent address. His name hadn't hit a bank account in 6 years. 1 driver's license renewal in Delaware, expired. A single court record, sealed. And then a mugshot from 1998. Slimmer face, dead eyes, charge listed as wire fraud, pled down. After that, Dross had either gone underground, changed identities, or ceased breathing. Wolfe's files had nothing. The tax records had less. Even the people who once worked near him answered with a shrug or a lie. I returned to the brownstone with a thin folder and a thinner sense of progress. He was declared dead in some databases, I said. He is not, Wolfe replied. That's optimism. No, that's deduction. Wolfe tapped the mugshot I'd printed. When a man chooses absence over erasure, he intends to return. I didn't argue, but I started to wonder, if Lucian Dross was alive, why had Varden listed him like a ghost? And if he was dead, who was haunting the rest of us? That evening, Wolfe was with his orchids. I let him be for an hour and a half, then brought him the day's files, warm beer, and 3 theories I didn't believe. He took the beer. He didn't touch the files. Miss Varden, I began, hates her father with the kind of passion usually reserved for war crimes. She said he was already dead, Wolfe murmured. Yes. And Sloane says Varden was paranoid, unstable, and preparing something big. And Lucian Dross, if he's real, is a dead man who hasn't finished his business. Wolfe didn't answer. He trimmed a leaf from a stubborn orchid and placed it on the tray beside him. Fritz served dinner, but Wolfe left most of it untouched. That, more than anything, raised a flag. He was thinking. Harder than he wanted me to know. I watched him from the corner of the room, where silence isn't an invitation, but a waiting room. He hadn't dismissed the envelope. He hadn't opened it again either. It remained on his desk, still sealed, still patient. I began to think the envelope had more weight than its contents, which, knowing Wolfe, was exactly why it stayed unopened. Around 10 the next morning, Wolfe sent me on a fool's errand. Not in name, of course, just an inquiry to a records office with all the warmth of a dead fish. I drove uptown, asked the right questions, got the wrong answers, and started the car again. That's when I saw it. There, on the inside of the windshield, fogged slightly from the autumn air, someone had written in a finger-dragged scrawl, "He lied to you." One of the names is already dead. It was fading fast. The heat of the engine had warmed the glass. I leaned in, staring, reading it twice to make sure I wasn't inventing it. I wasn't. No sign of forced entry. No disturbed seat. No smell. No footprint. Nothing. But someone had been in my car. Someone knew where I'd be. And someone wanted to send a message without leaving evidence. By the time I got back to the brownstone, the words had vanished completely. The fog lifted, and the warning with it. Wolfe glanced up as I entered, eyes flicking toward me, then away. I didn't speak. Neither did he. But the feeling followed me all the way into the office. We were no longer chasing ghosts. They were leaving notes. If the Bronx ever wanted to improve its reputation, finding a billionaire's corpse in an abandoned medical van wasn't the way to go about it. I read the morning bulletin with my coffee and half a croissant Fritz had laboured over like it was a Fabergé egg. Wolfe sat opposite, buried behind the Gazette, occasionally grunting at the state of civilization. "Stolen van, industrial district," I said. "Inside, Maxwell Varden, again. This time with a bullet hole where none belonged." Wolfe lowered his paper an inch. "Ah, so the dead have been corrected." "Freshly," I said. "Police confirm he was shot in the chest. Time of death estimated several hours after his supposed suicide." "Predictable," Wolfe muttered. "The first death was artifice. This one, affirmation. Kramer's got the department in hysterics. The morgue's embarrassed. Reporters are circling like stockbrokers in a bear market." "Let them gnaw," Wolfe said. "It keeps their teeth occupied." He folded the paper neatly and sighed. "A murder of the living and of the dead," he mused, "is still one corpse too many." I made a note of the phrase. Wolfe only waxed poetic when he was warming up. By afternoon, the coroner's report was in my hands, and Wolfe's mood had sunk to that dangerous stillness that means thinking is in progress. I read aloud, as if narrating to a sphinx. "Pentobarbital present, but non-lethal. Evidence of sedation. Death by gunshot at close range. Post-ingestion, not posthumous." "In English," Wolfe said. "He was alive when he got shot." "That much was obvious," Wolfe murmured. "Continue." "Residue on his jacket suggests he'd been moved. The body shows bruising consistent with transport." "Not suicide then," I concluded. "Someone drugged him, staged the scene, and finished the job later." Wolfe closed his eyes, as if to preserve energy for disdain. "Yes, Mr. Goodwin, we are witnessing a revision of narrative. Whoever killed him first wished us to think him penitent, then decided he deserved punishment instead." "Or someone didn't like the ending," I offered. "Exactly. The dead, too, are edited." That was Wolfe's version of approval. I filed the report away, though not before circling one line. "Time of death uncertain. Window between 8:00 p.m. and 2:00 a.m. If you've ever tried solving a murder in 6 hours of uncertainty, you know why I didn't whistle. When Inspector Kramer barges into Wolfe's office, the temperature drops 10 degrees, and that morning it nearly froze solid. He came in red-faced, jaw set, and cigar clamped like a weapon. "Where is it?" he barked. "Where," Wolfe said lazily, "is what? The letter. The damn envelope. You think I don't know he sent you something?" I leaned against the wall, hands in pockets. My role in these meetings was generally to act as a spectator until Kramer's blood pressure made intervention medical. Wolfe gestured toward the globe on his desk. "Inspector, if I were to possess an envelope, I assure you it would remain sealed until the occasion warranted otherwise." "Obstruction," Kramer growled. "Integrity," Wolfe countered. "You're protecting someone." "Mr. Varden," Wolfe said coolly, "is beyond protection. He has been murdered twice, first by deceit, then by design. I owe him at least one silence." That landed. Kramer stood, glaring, and for a long minute nobody moved. Finally he muttered, "If I find out you're sitting on evidence, I'll bury you in paperwork." Wolfe inclined his head. I've survived worse fates. Kramer left. The silence he left behind had more density than the cigar smoke he dragged in. The next 48 hours turned the city into a carnival of theories. Newspapers screamed about inheritance fraud, insurance conspiracies, and secret cults. Wolfe read none of it. He considered journalism a tool for the imaginative illiterate. I, on the other hand, fielded calls from every species of lunatic available. 3 reporters, 1 private investigator looking for a side contract, and a woman who insisted Varden had fathered her twins in Zurich. I told her to write to the embassy. When the phone finally stopped ringing, I found Wolfe in the office with a letter on his blotter. "Subpoena," he said. "From whom?" "Varden's estate attorney. He wishes to examine the contents of the envelope." "And your reply?" Wolfe lifted his beer and quoted, "Quid Latin dictum sit, altum videtur," meaning, "Whatever is said in Latin sounds profound." I declined. He sipped. "If the law insists on vanity, it may proceed without my assistance." I filed that under not for repetition in court. The lead came from a dock foreman who'd seen everything from counterfeit bills to corpses and regarded both as paperwork. Someone matching Lucien Dross's description had been spotted at Pier 47 2 nights before Varden's so-called suicide. "He looked like trouble with manners," the foreman said. "Paid in cash, didn't haggle, didn't smile. Asked about shipping manifests for medical equipment." "Name?" I asked. "Something foreign or fake." That narrowed it down to half the planet. I reported back to Wolfe, who listened without interrupting. When I finished, he grunted, a rare sign of approval. "So," I said, "Dross is either alive, impersonated, or resurrected." "Alive," Wolfe decided. "The dead do not requisition medical vans, nor do they employ cash. Unless they're very committed to character. That's your métier, Mr. Goodwin. Interpretation through irony. Mine is deduction. Find me the dock records for that night." I made a note to do exactly that, though I knew it would be as easy as extracting sincerity from a politician. Still, it was the first genuine movement we'd had. A ghost, it seemed, had decided to buy passage under an assumed name. And for Wolfe, that meant the game was no longer hypothetical. It had a pulse. Fritz found it after dinner. A thick, cream-coloured envelope slid neatly through the mail slot, without stamp, signature, or sender. He handed it to me as if it might detonate. Wolfe was in the office, nursing his beer and silence. I placed it on his desk beside the first one, which had gathered dust but not age. He looked at it, then at me. "Well?" he said. "You want me to open it?" "No." "Then you will?" "No." He finally lifted it, slit it with the same precision he reserves for insults, and withdrew a single sheet of paper. 3 words, typed cleanly in the centre. It wasn't suicide. He read it once, then laid it beside the first letter. The 2 envelopes now looked like bookends, holding in place the quiet of the room. "Dross?" I asked. Wolfe didn't answer. "You think someone's steering this?" He sighed. "We are being led, Mr. Goodwin, and I detest choreography." I said nothing. There wasn't much to add. Outside, the city moved as if it didn't know the dead were writing letters. Inside, Wolfe poured himself another beer, as if to steady the living, and I began to wonder just who the audience was supposed to be. If there's one thing you can count on in Manhattan, it's that money travels faster than hearses. By the time the ink dried on Maxwell Varden's obituary, his revised will had already surfaced in probate. I got my hands on a copy through a clerk who owed me a favour and owed the city 2 weeks' pay. The document was filed just hours before his death, fresh enough to smell of ink. It disinherited both Clara and Gregory Sloane, which struck me as bold considering they were the only 2 people left to talk about him. The new beneficiary was something called the Isotropic Humanity Foundation, a name that sounded like it had been assembled from a dictionary during a power outage. I brought it to Wolfe, who frowned at the title, as if it had personally affronted his education. Isotropic, he repeated, is a term of geometry and physics, not philanthropy. Humanity, in this context, is either irony or camouflage. Both are contemptible. He leaned back, steepled fingers pressing lightly against his chin. An unknown foundation, created to receive a fortune, 6 hours before its donor's demise. Coincidence? I asked. Only in weather reports, Wolfe said. Find the registration, Mr. Goodwin. That meant city records, foundation registries, and, worse, public officials. In New York, those are 3 synonyms for irritation. It took the better part of an afternoon and a bribe that would have bought Fritz a new copper pot, but I got what Wolfe wanted. The will had been witnessed and co-signed by one Lucian Dross. That name had become the thread in our collective sleeve. Tug it, and the whole suit might unravel. The problem was, officially, Lucian Dross wasn't alive to sign anything. Probate records showed no reinstatement, no death reversal, no legal trace of his existence post-2010. On paper, the man was as dead as Varden claimed to fear. When I relayed that, Wolfe didn't blink. He just poured himself another half-inch of beer and muttered, "One need not be legally living to commit fraud, merely strategically absent." "You mean someone forged it?" "Perhaps," he said. "But I doubt Mr. Varden would permit his own signature beside a phantom's, unless the phantom served a purpose." He looked almost amused. His version of it, which involves a brief twitch at the mouth and the faintest sniff. "We are no longer tracing inheritance, Mr. Goodwin. We are tracing intention." "And Dross?" "Find me where the dead sign documents," Wolfe said, "and I'll tell you what they're buying." I left the room with more questions than coffee, which is a poor exchange rate. Gregory Sloane's office was built for men who liked their reflections more than their employees. Everything was glass, chrome, and composure. He greeted me with the kind of handshake that tries to set boundaries and fails. I laid out the facts: disinheritance, Lucian Dross's ghostly reappearance, and the isotropic foundation. He smiled like a man reading his own favourable press. "Maxwell was losing his grip," Sloane said smoothly. "The last few months, he was paranoid, rambling about betrayal, conspiracies, people rewriting his story. I asked who those people were. All of us, Sloane said. His daughter, his partners, me. He'd been manipulated by someone clever enough to exploit that paranoia." He produced a folder of old memos full of Varden's musings about truth and legacy. They read, "Like the diary of a man at war with ghosts, and possibly himself." "Senile?" I asked. "Not senile," Sloane said. "Broken." He leaned back, confident he'd turned Varden's madness into his alibi. I left him polishing his cufflinks and mentally wrote "too smooth" beside his name. If grief was a performance, Sloane deserved a Tony. She came unannounced, late in the afternoon, when the house smelled of orchids and patience. Fritz let her in. I found her in the office, standing near Wolfe's yellow chair, like a defendant unsure of the verdict. "Miss Varden," Wolfe greeted, neither warmly nor coldly. "Sit." She did without protest, which was new. The last time we met, she'd been armoured in sarcasm. Now she looked undecorated. "My father called me the night before he died," she said. "He sounded frightened." Wolfe tilted his head. "Of whom?" "He didn't say. He just said he was afraid of himself." "An odd confession." She nodded. "He'd been different lately, restless. He talked about making things right. But when I pressed him, he said the truth was a weapon, and he wasn't sure he could use it." Her voice didn't break. It barely bent. I watched Wolfe watching her, fingers interlaced, gaze steady but inward. He was measuring something, either the tremor in her tone or the weight of her omission. When she finished, Wolfe said quietly, "You are telling the truth, but not the whole of it." Clara looked down. "I don't know the whole of it." She stood to leave. When the door closed, Wolfe murmured, "She does not lie, but she edits." Wolfe sat at his desk later that evening, eyes half shut, as if the room's silence were a chessboard only he could see. "Mr. Goodwin," he said finally, "we are now searching for a murderer of myth." I was writing notes. "You'll have to translate. Someone has built narratives," he continued, "each plausible, none consistent. Varden's death, the phantom witness, the daughter's half-truth, Sloane's civility, all threads in a tapestry designed to obscure, not reveal. And what does that make Dross?" "The tailor," Wolfe said, "or the mannequin." He leaned back, fingers steepled. 3 people tell 3 stories, all true in fragments, all false in conclusion. Someone is narrating from behind a curtain, and we obligingly are applauding shadows. I said, "Then what's real?" He opened his eyes. "Reality, Mr. Goodwin, is whatever remains when deceit grows tired." He reached for his beer. I knew that meant the conversation was over, or nearly so. Wolfe only waxed philosophical when his brain had already leapt ahead and was waiting for mine to catch up. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow, we confirm whether ghosts can rent office space." I didn't ask. I preferred suspense to ridicule. The Isotropic Humanity Foundation had an address, a respectable one near the East River, until I got there. Now, it had ashes. The building was a ruin, blackened brick and twisted steel beams, the skeleton of philanthropy gone wrong. A workman on the site told me it burned down nearly a year ago. Electrical fault, officially. Unofficially, nobody cared enough to contest it. No records survived, he said. No tenants either. The nameplate was still visible under the soot. Isotropic Humanity Foundation. I wiped a corner clean with my handkerchief. The letters were etched, not printed. Someone had spent money to make the illusion permanent. I stood there a while, letting the cold wind fill the silence. 6 months before Varden's will, the foundation he'd left everything to had already gone up in flames. That's not philanthropy, that's theatre. On the drive back, I couldn't stop thinking about Wolfe's phrase, a murderer of myth, because this was myth-making at its best, a burned address, a ghost signatory, and a corpse who'd planned his death with the precision of a dramatist. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting, already aware I'd learned something that made the story uglier. "Mr. Goodwin," he said mildly, "I trust you enjoyed your tour of the afterlife." I said, "It needs better lighting." He nodded. "So does the truth. I've seen my fair share of corpses, some theatrical, some pathetic, and a few that looked like they died apologizing. Gregory Sloane didn't fit any category. He was found behind his desk at the Midwood building, slouched in his leather chair, with a neat .38 caliber hole where his right temple used to be. No spatter, no second shot. Just one, clean, clinical, and considerate of the carpet. The drawers were all open, which would have looked like panic if they hadn't been empty. Files gone. Not misplaced, erased. Notebooks, contracts, loose memos, like the man had never done a day's work in his life. If he hadn't left a body behind, I might have believed it. Kramer was already there, scowling like the air was cheating him. "Inside job," he growled. "Financial fallout." He took a bite he couldn't swallow. Wolfe, seated 4 hours later in his chair with a brandy, did not agree. He raised one brow, his version of a triple somersault, and said, "2 deaths, Archie, but only one murderer has written them." I didn't ask what he meant. I just watched the orchid he was pruning, a pale specimen with a single black mark on its petal, and realized Wolfe wasn't raising his eyebrow at the crime. He was raising it at the signature. I don't consider myself an accountant. Hell, I count tips faster than I count trailing zeros. But I can smell cooked books like a dog sniffs stew. Sloane's office may have been wiped clean, but numbers leave a stink even soap can't kill. I started with his correspondence. A few stray memos, One receipt stub that escaped the purge, and a carbon copy hidden behind a drawer panel gave me a scent. The pattern wasn't blaring. It was a murmur. Coded transfers, initials instead of names. Sums that made no sense except to the man who made them. Wolfe, operating as the disembodied voice of reason from behind his desk, murmured like a priest hearing confessions. "What do they say, Archie?" "They say Sloane was holding leverage, quietly. Recurring payments, some kind of insurance, or blackmail." That word hits different when it's said over the clink of tea service. I dug deeper, poked a few ex-secretaries with regret in their eyes and ambition in their pasts. One remembered a locked drawer Sloane never touched when sober. Another recalled a man in a grey coat who came Tuesdays, never signed in, always left smiling. Someone had Sloane in their pocket, but it wasn't big enough to stop a bullet. The name Lucian Dross sounded too theatrical to be born, and it turns out it wasn't. After an afternoon of chasing bureaucratic shadows and asking archivists to spell amnesty backward, I found what we needed. Dross had died 5 years ago in Argentina, if you believed the certificate. The signature on that certificate belonged to a doctor who also signed off on a racing horse with tuberculosis. I brought that morsel back to Wolfe, who sat surrounded by a dozen Mazdavalias with the expression of a Roman emperor displeased with the aroma of the plebeians. "So," I said, "he's alive, and his name was never Dross, and he's been tucked inside Varden's empire this whole time." Wolfe didn't move. "As what?" "As an advisor, confidential, untouchable, probably untaxed." Wolfe nodded. "A neat resurrection, executed by cowards and rubber stamps." It tracked. The man who'd supposedly died was now steering Varden's legal trusts, whispering into ears, ghostwriting decisions with gloves on. It was all paper-thin and power-heavy. The kind of arrangement that reeks of cowardice and the illusion of permanence. Dross hadn't just changed names, he'd changed definitions. And in Wolfe's world, that's a mortal sin. Clara Varden had the look of a woman who learned early that disappointment wears a suit. You could see it in the way she poured her tea. Gently, as if noise might summon the ghosts she'd tried to forget. It took 3 days and one reluctantly poetic friend of hers to crack the shell. Turns out Clara had known about Dross. Not the name, not the shell game, but the man himself. She'd seen her father listen to him like scripture. She'd argued, privately, repeatedly, and begged Varden to end it. He trusted him more than his own family, the friend told me, with a shrug that meant this wasn't news. Old letters backed it up, half torn, half bitter, with phrases like "your precious counsellor" and "the stench of old sins." Wolfe read them in silence, turning each page like it might tear his gloves. Finally, he spoke, not loudly, but with the finality of a dropped curtain. "Bloodlines are brittle when shame is inherited." There was no reply to that, not even from me. The shame wasn't in knowing Dross. It was in knowing she couldn't remove him. Clara had lived in the house, but Dross had owned the locks. Negotiating with Inspector Kramer is like fencing with a rhinoceros. He doesn't dance, he doesn't bluff, and he never pretends to like you. But Wolfe had decided it was time for another duel, and I was dispatched to summon the beast. He arrived with all the charm of a tax audit and the cigar of a man who didn't care if the smell cleared wallpaper. Wolfe, in return, stayed seated, untouched and unbothered, like a particularly aloof sultan. The envelope with the confession sat between them like a porcelain dagger. "I want the coroner's notes," Wolfe said. "And I want the rest of that confession," Kramer replied. They might have been discussing lawn ornaments for all the heat in their voices, but the tension could have shredded rawhide. They sparred in clauses and caveats. Wolfe used polysyllables like scalpels. Kramer lobbed monosyllables like bricks. In the end, they struck a balance neither would admit. Wolfe slid a single redacted page from the envelope across the desk. Kramer, grunting, handed over a manila folder with the corner damp from sweat. I called it chess with sarcasm. Wolfe called it progress. Kramer called it nothing, which, from him, was practically a hug. And behind the trades, the case shifted. Quietly. The brownstone had its own clockwork. Meals, silence, orchids, deductions. As Fritz cleared the last of the lunch plates and I was halfway through my second cup of coffee, Wolfe spoke as if he'd been waiting for the room to empty of noise, not people. Lucian Dross is not a name, he said, eyes closed. It is a function. I waited, pen uncapped, because when Wolfe shifts into philosophy, it's never idle. He appears, Wolfe continued, when guilt requires a body to inhabit, when institutions need blame to breathe. He is inserted, cultivated, and when necessary, removed. Which makes him what? I asked. A scapegoat? No, a prism. He bends guilt to convenience. It was one of those moments where I couldn't tell if Wolfe was speaking about Dross or about the entire city outside our windows. The truth didn't matter, only the utility of the lie. The name had floated across signatures, whispered into decisions, pulled levers behind rich curtains. We weren't hunting a man. We were unraveling a need, a vacancy shaped like a person, and someone had filled it, used it, and discarded it when the weight got sharp. The real game had begun. Wolfe wasn't looking for Lucian Dross. He was looking for the one who needed him to exist. Wolfe called me into the office with a glance, no bell, no bellow, just the tilt of his head above the rims of his reading glasses, which in itself was enough to suggest gravity. You recall the envelope, he said, steepling his fingers like a philosopher on a cliff's edge. Its purpose was not to initiate investigation, but to ensure it. I gave a nod. Bait. Precisely. Varden did not summon us to avert a crime, nor even to unearth one. He hired us to validate what he already understood would happen. He paused, let the silence form a border around the sentence. Bear witness? I said slowly. Yes, detached, deliberate witness. He structured this entire charade so that the guilt, when it emerged, would land in hands that could neither profit nor bleed. We were not investigators, we were instruments. His final maneuver was not one of prevention, but of orchestration. He reached for the envelope, not to open it, but to place it exactly half an inch closer to the corner of the desk. A symbolic act, theatrical in its restraint. I looked at him. So, what does that make us? Wolfe's voice was nearly a murmur. Executioners by proxy. And there it was. The weight of a murder we hadn't seen, hadn't touched, but had been recruited to legitimize. The kind of justice only a man like Varden would consider moral. Cold, clean, and carried out at a distance. And yet, something told me the distance was shrinking. The name Lucian Dross had always felt like a disguise, and when it finally unraveled, it did so with the grace of a thread pulled from a cheap tuxedo. The real man. Raymond Squire, former chauffeur to Varden, sometime inmate at Sing Sing for a neat little fraud involving forged insurance checks and a vanished heiress. The reinvention had been quiet, meticulous. Squire had returned under a fresh alias, scrubbed clean by the passage of years and the erosion of memory. He worked his way back into Varden's good graces, not as a servant, but as an advisor, a vague title that meant everything and nothing, depending on the room. I found the original employment records buried in a warehouse file across town, courtesy of a disgruntled former bookkeeper who liked gin and hated secrets. Wolfe, of course, had anticipated the alias before I even left the house. The man who invents himself is most dangerous when the reinvention is complete, Wolfe said when I brought the files in. Dross was not a ghost, he was a blueprint, designed to be inhabited. And inhabit he had. He was the silent engineer of Varden's final play, the one who had sealed the second envelope. He wasn't just a witness to the story, he was its co-author. The only question left was, which parts had he written and which had he stolen? Clara came in without makeup and without malice. That alone was enough to set the tone. She sat where she'd sat before, But this time she didn't perch. She folded, like someone settling into grief that had hardened into form. Wolfe addressed her by her father's full name. Not Varden, not your father, but the whole string of syllables, formal as an indictment. She didn't flinch. She simply let her breath out as if she'd been holding it since the moment he died. He told me, she said. Not everything, but enough. The words came evenly, like someone stating facts for an insurance claim. But there was something else underneath. A tremor not in the voice, but in the gaps between them. The calm wasn't for us. It was for herself. He said some things needed to be buried, that some truths only survive if no one speaks them. But then he changed, started writing again, preparing things. He said he wanted it all out. Wolfe didn't speak. He didn't need to. Her confession wasn't about guilt. It was about the fear of inheritance, the kind that doesn't come with a will. Archie Goodwin, fool that I am, wanted to interrupt. But Wolfe had already begun to close the door inside her. She confessed with neither shame nor drama. That in itself was the tell. Most murderers offer resistance, as if guilt were a tax they intend to haggle. But Clara offered no discount, no denial. Just the simple truth. She killed her father to protect him, from himself. He would have ruined what little good remained, she said. Not because he wanted to hurt anyone, because he thought the truth would fix things. He didn't understand. It would have erased him. She had discovered the letters, the recordings, the files. Varden, the idealist with dirty hands, had begun preparing his confessions with the zeal of a man trying to die twice, once in body, once in image. He said I was the only one who still believed in him, she murmured. And then he tried to burn that too. She hadn't shot him in anger. She hadn't even planned it. She'd come to confront him and found him asleep. And with the quiet of a decision that had made itself, she had made him eternal. Wolfe's eyes were shut, not in rest, but in reverence, or maybe restraint. I sat still, unsure whether to judge or pity. Clara had chosen to preserve a lie, not for gain, not for malice, for love, the kind of love that erases as thoroughly as death. You wanted the idea of him, Wolfe said at last, more than the man himself. It wasn't an accusation, it was a pronouncement, as definitive as a closing argument and just as damning. Clara didn't argue. She folded her hands like someone waiting for absolution that wouldn't come. Wolfe's gaze didn't soften, not even as he reached for the phone. Inspector Kramer, please. She looked toward me then, not to plead, but to stand. She rose with the grace of someone expecting a sentence, not a verdict. I offered her my arm. She didn't take it. And as I led her to the hallway, she turned, not to me, but to Wolfe. It wasn't a plea. It was recognition. A final glance from one witness to another. Wolfe met her eyes, then looked away. Not cold, not kind, just final. When the front door shut behind us and her footsteps disappeared down the stoop with Kramer's men, I returned to the office. Wolfe hadn't moved, but something in the room had changed. Not the air, the weight of it. He reached for his glass of beer but didn't drink. Clara is not unique, he said, only honest. And that, I thought, might be the cruelest truth of all. Wolfe remained silent for nearly a full minute after I sat down again. That, in Wolfe time, is a paragraph. Then, almost inaudibly, he said, "She is not the only one who has killed a father tonight." I didn't ask. I didn't have to. Because I understood. Varden, in the weeks before his death, had orchestrated a sort of suicide by narrative. He had written his own downfall with the care of a historian curating someone else's ruin. The confessions, the files, the letters, they weren't acts of penance. They were instruments of transformation. He destroyed himself, Wolfe said, so that what remained could be managed, arranged, displayed perhaps like a museum of guilt. He reached for the envelope again. This time, He closed it. He did not merely die. He made his memory the crime scene. The orchids were unusually quiet that night. Or maybe it was me who'd gone deaf to the usual hum of domestic life. Fritz was clearing dishes somewhere in the background, and the world outside had slipped behind velvet dusk. And the final irony, Wolfe said, is that the one truth he feared most still breathes. Somewhere in those papers, in those absences, there is one more lie. One last face behind the curtain. He stood, not fully, but enough to lean forward. This case is over, he said, but the story isn't. And I knew then, Wolfe wasn't waiting for justice anymore. He was waiting for the last ghost to speak. Wolfe didn't pace, sigh, or adjust a single orchid stem when Kramer arrived. That alone should have warned the inspector something was amiss. The door had barely shut behind him when Wolfe began. "No preamble, Mr. Kramer," he said, voice smooth as oiled bronze. Miss Varden administered the fatal blow, not for profit, for narrative control. Kramer blinked, then scowled, his hand halfway to his coat pocket for a notepad he'd forgotten at home. Wolfe spared him the discomfort by proceeding with dispassionate clarity. Dates, motives, the overlapping shadows of dross and squire, and the cruel precision with which the entire fable had been staged. He neither asked for belief nor offered apology, just the facts, as clean as bone. She saw what her father was about to do, Wolfe said. She prevented it, not to save herself, but to protect an idea, however misguided, of who he had once been. Kramer was quiet longer than usual. When he finally reached for a cigar, it was with the slow resignation of a man lighting something he wouldn't enjoy. He struck the match and held the flame without moving. "I'll need your signed statement," he muttered. "You shall have it," Wolfe replied. "Though understand this, she acted on an ethic I do not share, but I respect her logic." Kramer grunted, but said nothing. He smoked in silence. Wolfe leaned back, his fingers steepled. It was, perhaps, the only trial either of them would attend. I watched from the opposite curb, arms folded, hat low, posture casual enough not to spook a squirrel. Clara Varden stepped from the brownstone like she was heading to a matinee, not the back seat of a patrol car. No handcuffs, no dramatics, no swan song. Just a wool coat, gloves, and a slight furrow in her brow that hadn't been there the night before. Kramer stood by the open car door, neither urging her forward nor offering his arm. Clara moved without prompting, slid into the back seat, and folded her hands like she was waiting for a train. She didn't speak. She didn't ask for an attorney. Hell, she didn't even glance back at the house. There's a kind of silence I've seen in courts, hospitals, and 1 or 2 hotel rooms at 3 a.m. The silence of someone who has sentenced themselves long before the law arrived. Clara wore it like perfume, subtle, suffocating. I stayed on the sidewalk as the car pulled away. The tires didn't squeal. There were no reporters, no curious neighbors leaning from windows, just the quiet dignity of a woman walking into her own footnote. If that was grief, it had already passed her. If it was shame, it was old and dry. By noon the next day, the city's more excitable newspapers had developed a taste for melodrama and ink. "Heiress of death!" screamed one. "Daughter of the damned!" shrieked another, probably over cold coffee and typewriter fumes. Nero Wolfe, whose patience for journalistic invention hovers somewhere between mold and bubonic plague, remained unmoved. He didn't read the papers, of course. I did that for him, as always, with the critical eye of a man compiling a scrapbook for posterity and possible blackmail. One column, reprinted in several afternoon editions, theorized that Wolfe had orchestrated the entire affair as a psychological experiment to expose inherited guilt. Another compared Clara Varden to Medea with better posture. When I laid a particularly garish headline on his desk, "Genius Detective Traps Patricidal Muse," Wolfe stared at it as if it were an overcooked egg. "Idiocy," he declared. He returned to his beer. I clipped the piece anyway. One day I figured the archives of nonsense might be useful, or at least entertaining. The greenhouse had its own rhythm, one that even murder couldn't disrupt. Wolfe, surrounded by chlorophyll and silence, resumed his ministrations as if the world beyond the glass had never heard the name Varden. He trimmed a masdevallia with surgical calm, its petals trembling under his breath. I brought him a bottle, frosted, Belgian, nothing vulgar, and left it within reach, but not comment. Fritz appeared briefly with trout, as if nothing unusual had transpired this week besides a troublesome sauce reduction. We didn't speak of Clara. We didn't speak at all. Wolfe's hands moved with precision, never rushed, never idle. Watching him tend orchids was like watching someone confess without words. Each cut, each repositioning, seemed to prune memory as much as foliage. After 15 minutes of ambient quiet, he murmured, "Not to me, not quite to himself. Legacy is illusion, Mr. Goodwin, but illusion has its gardeners." I nodded, though I wasn't sure he noticed. Sometimes, when Wolfe mourns, he does it like everything else, from a safe distance, under control, and wearing the armor of abstraction. I knew better than to break that silence. Grief, for him, had always been an intellectual indulgence. I stepped back and let him prune what remained. There was one thing I hadn't mentioned, not to Wolfe, not even to myself in any meaningful way. But it had been there, since the start, folded between confession pages and counterfeit receipts. The original envelope, the one Varden had mailed to us, had a note tucked in its inner crease. A single line, handwritten in black ink that had bled slightly into the paper's grain. It said, "You understand guilt, Mr. Wolfe. It is the root beneath every orchid." Wolfe never commented on it. He'd read it, of course. He reads everything. But not a word escaped his lips about that particular sentence, and I hadn't dared ask. Now, days later, I found myself rereading it while filing the case into our archives. The phrase lingered like a fingerprint on glass. Wolfe, from the dining room, lifted his glass and called for more beer. I brought it. I didn't bring the letter, because the truth is, the sentence wasn't for the case. It was for Wolfe. He hadn't taken Varden's request because of money, or reputation, or boredom. He'd taken it because guilt is something he recognizes, not as a weakness, but as a motive dressed in reason's clothes. As I returned to the office, the line echoed in my head like a bell rung in a quiet church. Sometimes, I thought, knowing the root doesn't make the orchid easier to grow, or easier to forget. Justice, that slippery ideal we all pretend has sharp corners, had been done. At least Kramer thought so, the press thought so. Even Fritz, who never editorialized past parsley, had seemed content with the outcome. But Wolfe didn't look lighter, and neither did I. The brownstone settled into its usual tempo. Files closed, letters burned, orchids trimmed. The quiet hum of everything returning to its former silence, except inside. Varden, that puppet master of dying breath, had succeeded more than he'd failed. His story had landed precisely where he wanted it to, not in the courts, not in headlines, but in the marrow of those left behind. He had forced his legacy into our hands and dared us to make meaning out of it. And we had, or tried to. Wolfe remained quiet for the rest of the day. I returned to my typewriter, fingers steady, conscience less so. There are confessions that bring relief, and there are those that stain the paper before they're even written. Varden's had done both. He had told the truth, yes, but had used it as a scalpel, not a salve. As I wrote the final line of the report, I didn't feel the case close. Some confessions are written in ink, the worst are written in silence, and never end. In the end, the truth came quietly, like the closing of a book no one truly wanted to finish. Justice had its hour, but not its triumph. A daughter's love became her weapon, a father's guilt his monument, and Wolfe simply tended his orchids as if pruning beauty could balance the weight of what men choose to hide. Some mysteries end with confession. Others linger, unspoken, in the spaces between right and reason. What would you have done in Wolfe's place? Condemn her or understand her? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Sometimes, even the sharpest minds can't escape the shadows of the past.